You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio. Welcome to the Bitter Medicine Podcast, where it's all about Black empowerment. Our show focuses on Black news and entertainment, arts, science, economics, history, people, and strategies that uplift, empower, and motivate Africans within the diaspora. And now, your host, whose favorite color is black, Goku.
Yes, indeed. Welcome back to the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Goku. Make sure you guys share, like, comment, and subscribe. Let's help this channel grow. YouTube is playing some games with the likes, as you heard in the last episode. And we proved it again today. I had some help from some folks who follow the show. We had a bunch of likes on this episode before we even started. And of course, YouTube took away the likes. With that said, if you're here with me right now, make sure you like the video. Clearly YouTube or whoever, and is messing with the likes. Let's counter that by making sure that we like the video. All right, let's counter that as much as we can. Before I go any further, I want to remind you guys that this show is a part of a podcast network that's growing. And if you're interested and you have a voice and you have something to say that is along the lines of Pan-Africanism and all that entails, Black nationalism, right? By all means, let us know. Let them know at KWAZ Radio that you would like to lend your voice to the podcast network. But because this show is a part of the podcast network, I gotta big up the shows that are on the network already.
This is DAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-Black perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
You can also check out the Queen's Council podcast that just dropped a new episode recently. So check out those shows on the podcast network. Make sure you follow KWAZ Radio on YouTube. All right, make sure you follow them. Let's get that channel to grow as well, because that channel will the visibility of that channel will make the other shows much more visible on the network. Before I begin today's show, and I'm not here to really read a paper tonight, because in the last episode a bunch of folks who were in the chat room talking about Hannibal Barca, and hopefully those folks show up tonight. If they don't, then I will read something, or at least skim through something, right? But this is a topic that has gotten much ire from these Eurasian folks, these European folks, right? They have a real stick up their asses about Hannibal, the character and the likeness, right? If you don't know, Hannibal, they did a History Channel, I guess it was a movie, portraying Hannibal as black, and whites were outraged, right? Whites were outraged. Why would whites be outraged at that? Well, because Hannibal, this African, was a thorn in the side of the Romans. All right, if you do a quick lookup of Hannibal, you'll see something. You'll see along the lines, people will say that Hannibal was a renowned general and statesman. He was known for his skill as a commander and his contributions to the army. He was born in 247 BC to Hamilcar Barca, who was also a chief in the Carthaginian army. Bago and Hasdrubal were his younger brothers. All his family members were employed in the army and made major contributions to many wars. His father, by the way, was a part of what's called the Mercenary War. He died during the Mercenary War, but before he died, he taught Hannibal that Rome is your enemy. Hannibal was born in Tunisia, in the Mediterranean region. His name is of Latin origin and unique in Carthaginian culture. He had a difficult childhood. His father was busily engaged in the Mercenary War, as I mentioned. The situation was made worse when his sisters both became engaged and he lost their support. Hamilcar decided to improve Carthage's fate after it suffered losses in the First Punic War, and Hannibal supported his father in building a strong army and fighting the Romans. At the age of 9, Hannibal was introduced to Roman and Carthage rivalry. He was made commander-in-chief of his troops and was given extensive training in the army at the same time. Right? So that tells you something about Hannibal. His life was dedicated to fighting the Roman Empire. Right? Again, like I said, his father, Hamilcar, introduced him to Rome, or I should say the Roman wars, and trained him in the army. Rome was always a threat to Carthage. The Barca family fought against them throughout their lives. Okay? Those guys, like Hannibal, his father made him swear to maintain Rome as an enemy. And that's one of the things we don't have. We're not practicing that type of balls, right, in this day and age. Right? We don't have that kind of balls to say, I swear these folks are my enemy. Right? I swear these folks are my enemy. What's also interesting too is that Hannibal had a good education. So not only was he trained in warring, but he also had a good education. He was multilingual, from what I understand. In fact, just what I said earlier, in that description of him, his name was of Latin origin, right? His name was of Latin origin, which denotes that his people were scholarly, right? He learned from ancient Greek teachers, while his father was out there fighting, and even apparently learned some war techniques from the Greeks, who of course learned it from the Africans themselves. Let's see what the chat room is saying so far. In the chat room, the pro-black perspective is with us. He says Hannibal time. All right. Before the pro-black perspective came in, actually, early on, I saw Derica Cooper Photography was here. He said Muzungu wants us to believe Hannibal was a Muzungu. Yep, because they don't want to own up to that, to the fact that this African, right, this black guy, was a thorn in their side. Black Excellence says greetings early on. Kevin Kerr came in and said good evening to everybody. Kevin Kerr says the other day I saw some of our people still going to Asians establishment. Okay, we're not talking about Asians tonight. One of them did not like the way the cake tasted, told the server. The server promptly called the NYPD. I did see that. Black Excellence says to Kevin Kerr, they will never learn. Something bad happens to them in these businesses, or well, they're on their own. I came in and I mentioned something that I said at the start of the show, which is that they're messing with the likes for certain. There's no doubt about it now. NYC Sports Archives came in address Kevin Care and Black Excellence, and I'm sick and tired of that. Saw the video too, that's on them. You see the other video of an Asian man calling the police and lying about a black couple pointing. I saw that too. That's the one where the guys are in the car listening to the Asians call the police. You know, they lied, these Asians lied and said these black guys were pointing a gun at them. NYC Sports Archive says, at this point, if you still support the establishment, you are on your own. Kevin Care 42 says, oh well, on to the business at hand. That's correct. The business at hand is Hannibal time. So I don't see a lot of folks who were here talking about Hannibal last time. So I'll do a little bit of reading here and there in the meantime. So I have this paper called The Character of Hannibal, written by H.V. Canter, University of Illinois. Hannibal, ancient history finds one of its most interesting as well as most pathetic figures. His fame as a general and statesman, well recognized in antiquity, remains secure. The steadfastness of purpose, organizing ability, and mastery of military science history can scarcely show an equal. You gotta like how that read, right? Can scarcely show an equal. But Rome was victor over Carthage, both on the field of battle and in the record of their struggles. Carthage perished, leaving no historian to tell her story. Hence, Hannibal in ancient times had no sympathetic interpreter of his life and deeds. We learn of him almost solely from partial and even hostile authors who did not understand, apparently, not care to understand, his real character. Occasionally, Roman and pro-Roman writers say something favorable about Hannibal, but usually they distort and exaggerate features of his character, which were necessarily stern in that day. Romans, far from doing justice to their great antagonist, far from forgiving, much less forgetting him, indeed scarcely thinking of him without a feeling of rage and dread, tried in every way to blacken his memory. Wrote and repeated stories of his barbarities and poured out the poison of their hatred in baseless and revolting accusations. True, the calumnious inventions of Roman hatred were generally rejected by the painstaking and scrupulous Polybius. It is true also that most of the specific charges against Hannibal, when subjected to scrutiny, supply materials for their own refutation. Hence, Hannibal's moral character stands high in the estimation of historians like Ein and Mommsen and biographers like Dodge, Harris, and others, who see in the great Carthaginian a figure which towers above the greatest of his contemporaries, a man essentially more magnanimous and humane in war than his Roman antagonists, right? And conquerors. They hear alike of Hamilcar Barca's hatred and of his genius, the embodiment of national revenge. Hannibal was yet less barbarous than his nation or his times. Little is known directly of Hannibal's private life and character. In education, he was probably superior to any of his opponents. We learn that he kept about him literary men like Silenus and Soslius, right? The latter of whom was his teacher in Greek, a language which he spoke and in which he composed a history to the Rhodians on the acts of Manlius Volsa. He was proficient in Punic and possibly other languages. Right? That's why I said he was multilingual. Right? But it is not probable that we shall ever have a satisfying moral and intellectual profile of Hannibal, shall ever know whether he was a good husband and father, a kind friend, a man of confidences, courtesies, and tender sympathies. We read of detached facts and anecdotes about him, nearly all having to do with military operations. But but it is doubtful whether any other man ever played such an important part in history, about whom so little of the purely personal has been preserved. Here and there in the sources, various expressions of this nature are attributed to Hannibal, but usually the rhetorical pointing leaves their genuineness open to suspicion. For example, his pleasantry about Fabius, his ranking of great generals, and his dying words. It is the purpose of this paper to examine briefly the evidence for the main charges against Hannibal, charges in specific instances of cruelty, perfidy, sacrilege, avarice, and immorality. As preliminary to this task, we must note several ancient direct characterizations of Hannibal that have reached us, substance of which is as follows. Livy's well-known account deals with fundamentals. After mention of Hannibal's physical and social qualities that made him a highly valuable soldier, fitted for the opposite duties of obeying and giving orders, Livy adds that these virtues were balanced by great faults: inhuman cruelty, perfidy, more than Punic, total disregard for truth, no reverence for things sacred, no fear of the gods, no regard for an oath, no voice of conscience. With these charges allowing fully for a Roman historian's aim to set things in a light favorable to his country's cause, it is impossible to reconcile Livy's wholly favorable characterization, in which, closely following Polybius, he cannot decide whether Hannibal was the more wonderful an adversary or prosperity. Polybius's discussion of Hannibal's character is the most discriminating and truthful one available. It can be reviewed here only in barest outline. Hannibal was the one man and one mind of all good or ill that befell Romans and Carthaginians. A correct estimate of his character is not easy, because of the influence exercised upon it by counsel of friends or by force of extraordinary circumstances. He was obliged to abandon some cities which had gone over to him, to treat others harshly by removing the inhabitants and seizing their property, consequence of which he was accused by them of impiety and cruelty. Prevailing opinion about him at Carthage was that he was greedy of money, at Rome that he was cruel. Diodorus Siculus, an author devoid of critical faculty or his historical insight, gives 3 short general accounts, which yield little of importance. Justinius says that Hannibal never reclined at his meals, was moderate in use of wine, and practiced such continence amid strong temptation that one would be disposed to deny his African origin. That so judicious was his command that he was never annoyed by any conspiracy of his soldiers or betrayed by their want of faith, although his enemies often attempted to expose him to both. In Dio Cassius is found a sober and somewhat detailed review of Hannibal's character. All of Carthage's allies against Rome taken together were scarcely his equal. He could understand clearly and plan expeditiously every project taken to heart, albeit sureness, as a rule, the outcome of deliberation. Instable of a hasty disposition, his ability to appraise accurately the ordinary and unusual, to meet each occasion with suitable words and action, was due not only to natural capacity, but to cultivated mental powers. Cultivated mental powers. That reminds me of something I was watching earlier today. His physique was perfect, and his body was kept agile. Hence, he could with safety stand his ground, run or hide at full tilt. He never overburdened himself with food, nor yet was weakened from want of it. He saw that most men were to be trusted only insofar as self-interest is served, dealt with them on this basis. He treated harshly anyone who seemed desirous of doing him harm. He showed excessive deference to those of whom he had need, gave them that which he denied himself, shared the same fear, the same danger with them, and was the first to perform every task demanded of them. Toward others, he was very stern, with the result that people felt toward him either goodwill or fear, according as he shared their similar condition in life, or as he held aloof from them. Okay. Let's check in with the chat room. As the chat room started their discussion, I see that KW Don 7 is in the room. He said Urugu's attempt to whiten Hannibal is laughable. I've never heard of Urugu riding into war atop of elephants, along with the artifacts like coins that support the fact that he was an African. Yeah, that's true. I should have pulled this up earlier. But there is a the image that they show you of Hannibal is funny, right? And let me see if I can find it right now on the fly. But there's a coin, right? There's a coin that has always shown Hannibal to look, quote unquote, nappy-headed or coiled, coiled hair. And the thing is, well, here's a question for you guys. If you had a thriving African nation, right? And a European from Rome was able to come and be a thorn in your side, would you want that story out there? Wouldn't you try yourself to minimize that story? Sometimes we gotta look at it from the other side too. Not that we're cheering for these assholes, but we gotta look at it like, yeah, if it was me, I would wanna keep that on the low too, right? Where am I? So we see here, right? We see here when they make their images of Hannibal, it's this kind of whole shit that we see on the right hand side, right? That sculpture, that's what they would claim is the image of Hannibal, right? In fact, that's the images you see when you go to Wikipedia, right? And again, do you blame them? But when you go to like Black History Heroes, they've shown coins of Hannibal on one side of the coin and the elephant, right, on the other side of the coin, which goes to what KW Dawn 7 was talking about in the chat room, right? The mastery of using these elephants in that time, I don't think we've seen any equal, right, from the European side, right? But that's the game, and that's, as this paper said, and as we've heard it all our lives, essentially, the victor is the one who writes the history, right? The victor is the one who writes the history. And so when you lose, right, the loser actually suffers more losses, right? The loser becomes forgettable if the winner so decides to blacken his history, his or her history, or I should say his or our story, I guess. If that's what the winner decides to do, then that's it for us. And then they get to come along and change the phenotype, right? They get to come along and change the phenotype of our people. That's why you gotta win. Just simple as that. You gotta win. I see Dorico Cooper Photography is back in the chat room. Peace to you. I shall continue with the reading. Writing of their conflict with Hannibal, the Romans faced a good deal of humiliation, either to be acknowledged or explained away. You had two choices then. Either you acknowledge that this African, right, a black guy, was one of the biggest thorns in your side, or you just find a way to explain it away. The latter alternative was usually chosen, and its realization was facilitated by depicting Hannibal either as a Superman or a monster. Pain of defeat and disaster would obviously be mitigated if these were represented as coming from an antagonist superior to human and natural obstacles, a warrior favored with help and guidance more than mortal. Doubtless, too, in many cases, Hannibal's acts and achievements were exaggerated to make even more enjoyable and more dramatic to Roman readers his later reversal of fortune. This disfiguration of Hannibal's intellectual and moral character, early begun and continued when his undertakings had become a common theme of the rhetoricians, the rhetoric. I'm talking like I can't read, right? Of the rhetoricians, I guess, was vainly combated by Polybius, who comments on the inconsistency in and perversion of fact by historians in that they represent Hannibal as a prodigy of strategic skill and boldness, and at the same time as acting with amazing indiscretion. Polybius maintains that Hannibal conducted his expedition into Italy with consummate prudence and was reliably informed as to country, roads, peoples, and the practicability of his undertaking. The absurd amounts of Hannibal's passage of the Rhone and the Alps may have caused the belief that he was a reckless, mad, cruel, and inhumane leader. Right? So this is part of what KW Don is talking about. Right. The absurd accounts of Hannibal's passage of the Rhone and the Alps may well have caused the belief that he was a reckless, mad, cruel, and inhumane leader, for having guided to almost inevitable annihilation an army on which rested in great part the destiny of his country. Misrepresentation and calumnies begun during his life were doubtless in many cases transmitted to later writers through the words of the intense patriot Q. Fabius Pictor and L. Cincius Alimentus. Hey, do Romans still have these kind of names? Do modern day Romans still give these kind of names? All right. I'm just curious if you guys are familiar with that. All right. Enrico Cooper Photography says in the chat room that losers are written about. You must win in order to control the narrative. And the fact of the matter is, the winner doesn't even have to talk about the loser. Oftentimes, half the stuff the loser did isn't even mentioned, right? They just talk about their greatness. The winner does. Enrico Cooper Photography says Hannibal led by example. Goes on to say those that lead by example will always have followers, right? Hannibal, of course, bore a full share of the antipathy felt towards his countrymen. Not a little ill repute was bequeathed to the Carthaginians by the parent stock, the Phoenicians, who had made themselves hated in earlier days by their grasping commercial policy and love of gain. The Carthaginians were very generally regarded by the Romans as cunning, deceitful, treacherous, and devoid of honor. How many of you are familiar with the Carthaginians? Is that is that your understanding of the Carthaginians, or is this Roman propaganda? Is this Roman propaganda? Brought into frequent contact with traders and strangers and forced to match wits with them, they inevitably practice sharp bargaining in the interest of gain. Moreover, Carthage's commercial methods were selfish, oppressive, and offensive. Her ambition was to exclude from African and Spanish waters the vessels of other nations, and to control a monopoly of trade. Now, isn't that something? Isn't that something? Look, let me read that again. Moreover, Carthage's commercial methods were selfish, oppressive, and offensive. Her ambition was to exclude from African and Spanish waters the vessels of other nations, to control a monopoly of trade. Her sailors took the utmost care to conceal the trade routes followed, as we see in the story of Strabo, of a Carthaginian ship which preferred to be driven out of course and sunk, rather than reveal to her Roman pursuer the course to the Cassiterides, or the Tin Islands. Imagine that. Meanwhile, you go on Twitter and someone says something that some white folks don't get, and here comes black folks giving them the full rundown, the full scoop on what it is that's being talked about. These folks, Africans, said, shit, I'd rather run this shit down into the ocean before I let your ilk know the passages, know the routes. We out here giving these folks information. Carthage early had commercial and political interests in the Western Mediterranean. Rome's more important commerce developed much later, but long prior to the third of the treaties between the two powers. Trade regulations, protection of allies, etc., were matters of serious dispute, questions which pass easily and surely into the more irritating issue of territorial control, and finally, with Rome's winning of Magna Graecia, into the momentous one of Rome's foreign policy, her political and territorial expansion. A long period of conscious rivalry and smoldering antagonism, soon to burst into the flame of war, are the genesis of Rome's sustained hatred for Carthage and her Hannibal. All right. Turning to special charges against Hannibal, that of sensuous living deserves scant consideration. He and his army spent the winter following the Battle of Cannae at Capau, celebrated in antiquity for its mild climate, wealth, and luxury. Voluptuous Capau became the fondly cherished nemesis of Roman legend. Its alleged enervating effect on Hannibal and his army became a favorite theme of rhetorical exaggeration, one that is repeated to this day. Polybius says nothing of loose living at Capau. On the contrary, he relates that Hannibal did not once, while in Italy, release his army from service, but kept his vast numbers under control like a good helmsman. The falsity of such popular rhetoric is shown by the fact that, although the war afterwards was one of charged character and subsequent campaigns were less favorable to Hannibal, he and his army could and did fight effectively after I guess it's Capua, right? Not Capua, Capua, right? The tradition was no doubt invented to give a malicious interpretation of Hannibal's inactivity during this period. Apparently, the same purpose is seen in the charge of Hannibal's illegitimate love affair. According to Livy, Hannibal married a woman of Castulu, Spain. But nothing more is known of this union, unless it is referred to by Silius Italicus, who makes Hannibal express the wish to return from Italy to his son and faithful wife. Appian mentions in a casual way indulgence in Lucania, of which Pliny says merely oppidum, salapi. I don't know why they do stuff like this. Right? Whatever. Such irregularity was scarcely a matter of serious censure in ancient times, and doubt is cast on the entire charge by testimony of an opposite character in Justinius. The reproach of avarice has little foundation. Livy's characterization contains no mention of avarice, but in Hannibal's natural inclination toward this failing is said to have led him to plunder places he could not hold. This is an inconsistent and gratuitous fling, since the real purpose, as Livy states further on, was to prevent anything of value from falling into the enemy's possession. In the ordinary acceptation of the word avarice, Hannibal was far from such weakness. He was occupied body and mind by an undertaking and issues more momentous than those of mere self-interest. Right? The guy was not about self-interest. Right? Let's check in with the chat room and see what they've got to add to the conversation. Kevin Kerr says that it's Roman propaganda. Enrico Cooper Photography says Carthage is the ancient Benghazi. Libya, that area is called Barca on maps from the 1800s. If your enemy is writing good things about you, then you are not doing your job. That's KW Don 7. KW Don 7 says if your enemy is writing good things about you, then you're not doing your job. Enrico Cooper Photography says go watch the film Gladiator, starring Russell Crowe, and watch with the eyes of seeing Hannibal as Russell Crowe's character, but way more badass, right? And Hannibal was, no, sorry, not Hannibal. This film you're talking about, Gladiator, was actually a decent film, but you're right. Watch it and think of him as Hannibal when you watch the film, right? But of course, recognize that Hannibal is just supreme. War against Rome was for him a necessary national undertaking, not one of personal ambition or aggrandizement. Insofar as its acts have the color of avarice, it was avarice of a public character, necessary to meet the needs of a large army, to prosecute far from home a war of ever-changing character and genuinely perplexing problems. At least a partial basis of the charge of avarice is to be seen in the account which Fabius Pictor gave of the origin of the war, that Hannibal, a zealous supporter and initiator of the ambitious Hasdrubal, had brought about the war with Rome on his own authority, for selfish purposes, and contrary to the wish of Carthage. Fabius's account is vigorously refuted by Polybius. There's no reason for supporting that Hamilcar and his successors aimed at the establishment of a Spanish kingdom independent of Carthage, or acted contrary to the wishes of the majority of their countrymen. Rhetorical exaggeration is responsible for the alleged treasonable tendencies of Hanno and the Senate. As for Hannibal, Carthage maintained the war and supported him for 17 years. The war's entire course of events refutes the speech which Livy ascribes to Hannibal on leaving Italy. The charge of avarice finds expression also in the words of the Carthaginian ambassadors, who sought to cast on Hannibal the entire blame for the disastrous outcome of the war. This speech by Livy clearly rests on a belief that Hannibal was guilty as charged, but it also almost certainly not the original, for Hannibal was still influential at Carthage, and would have been perilous for ambassadors to use the words reported by Livy. In any case, the trustworthiness of the embassy is impeached by the fact that its members are represented as coming to ask the Romans for the renewal of a peace of whose terms they acknowledge they knew nothing. I have a question for you guys who are live with me too. What's the phenotype of Spain during this time? What's the phenotype of Spain during this time? Right? But in this bit of text that we just went over, we know that Hannibal was a great leader. Right? He learned to lead from the front, as Dorico Cooper Photography said. Right? If you look at the Punic Wars and the history of, and the history of the Punic Wars, you'll see the evidence of his leadership qualities. Right? Excellent at military, excellent at warring. Right? One of the catch terms with Hannibal is the battle of Kane. Right? Look up the Battle of Kane. Right? If you look up just on Wikipedia alone, the Battle of Kane was a key engagement of the Second Punic War between the Roman Republic and Carthage, fought on the 2nd of August, 216 BC, near the ancient village of Kane in Apulia, right, southeast Italy. The Carthaginians and their allies, led by Hannibal, surrounded and practically annihilated a larger Roman and Italian army under the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. It is regarded as one of the greatest tactical feats in military history, one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Right? If you jump down to, let's say, tactical deployment, the conventional deployment for armies of the time was placement of infantry in the center with the cavalry in two flanking wings. The Romans followed this convention fairly closely, but chose extra depth rather than breadth for the infantry in hopes of breaking quickly through the center of Hannibal's line. Varro knew how the Roman infantry had managed to penetrate Hannibal's center at Trebia, and he planned to recreate this on an even greater scale. The principals, right? The principes, right? That's the guys with spears, were stationed immediately behind the hastati, right? That's guys with spears and swords, I think, ready to push forward at first contact to ensure the Romans presented a unified front. As Polybius wrote, the maniples, right, were nearer each other, or the intervals were decreased. The maniples showed more depth than front. Even though they outnumbered the Carthaginians, this depth-oriented deployment meant that the Roman lines had a front of roughly equal size to their numerically inferior opponents. Typical style of ancient warfare was to continuously pour infantry into the center and attempt to overpower the enemy. Hannibal understood that the Romans fought their battles like this and he took this outnumbered army and strategically placed them around the enemy to win a tactical victory. Hannibal had deployed his forces based on the particular fighting qualities of each unit, taking into consideration both their strengths and weaknesses. This aspect of Hannibal's leadership was highlighted in the use of a Spanish unit, the Balearic Slingers, whom he placed behind the infantry to hurl their ranged missiles into the masses of Roman troops. He placed his Iberians, or Celtiberians, and Gauls in the middle, alternating the ethnic composition between Spaniards and Gauls across the front line, with himself at the front and center alongside his brother Mago. Roman sources claim their placement was chosen for being the most expendable and unreliable troops, but modern reflections believe those forces were actually selected for their battle hardening to carry the weight of the Punic side, as they were tasked with the controlled retreat that ultimately made possible Hannibal's pincer movements. Meanwhile, infantry from Punic Africa was on the wings at the very edge of his infantry line. This infantry would remain cohesive and attack the Roman flanks. Hasdrubal, his brother, led the Spanish and Gallic cavalry on the left of the Carthaginian army, placing the flank of his army on the Aufidus. Hannibal prevented this flank from being overlapped by the more numerous Romans. Hannibal was given 6,000 to 7,000 cavalry, and Hanno had 3,000 to 4,000 Numidians on the right. Hannibal intended that his cavalry, comprising mainly medium Hispanic cavalry and Numidian light horse, and positioned on the flanks, would defeat the weaker Roman cavalry and swing around to attack the Roman infantry from the rear as it pressed upon Hannibal's weakening center. His veteran African troops would then press in from the flanks at the crucial moment and encircle the overextended Romans. The Romans were in front of the hill leading to Kane and hemmed in on their right flank by the river Aufidus, so that their left flank was the only viable means of retreat. In addition, the Carthaginian forces had maneuvered so that the Romans would face east. Not only would the morning sun shine low into the Romans' eyes, but the southeasterly winds would blow sand and dust into their faces as they approached the battlefield. Hannibal's deployment of his army, based on this perception of the terrain and understanding of the capabilities of his troops, proved decisive. You know, as I read that, I'm reminded of, you know, we just had so-called Easter that passed. And when I was a kid back home growing up, there would be these Easter movies that would come on the Friday holiday as well as the Sunday holiday of Easter, right? And there was one movie, I don't remember the name of it now, but it had King Solomon in it. And in this movie, and I think this is actually, I think this might be in the Bible as well. I can't remember now. But they shined up their shields, and they had the enemy with the enemy's backs was to the sun. And so when the enemy started to advance, they turned their shields around, and the light from the shields blinded them, and they just went through and slaughtered these folks. So I just got that imagery when I read this just now about what Hannibal did, and it's impressive. It's really because the thing about military science is like a big part of that is psychology, right? He studied these folks. He realized they psychologically they tend to do the same thing over and over. And he found a way to get them. As they were pushing through in the center of the line, these guys were going around the edges. And you know who also did something like that? Shaka Zulu. we gotta start to learn warring, not the rhetoric and the talk about it, but we really gotta sit down and start studying the science of it. You know, we have some folks in the chat room. I think Derico Cooper is one of them. Forgive me if I'm missing anyone else, but guys who served in the military in the past. I've always said it, like, you know, there's things we can be doing, there's activities we can be doing in the areas where we live, where we get these former military guys who understand, who have good training and understand how to strategize, you know, get those guys to start teaching our folks, you know, how to get together and what to do when that time comes. Rico Cooper just said if you play spades, that is called running a Boston. Real life war, not Call of Duty. It's called running a Boston. Okay. See, that's why I'm saying, like, you get a bunch of ex-military dudes who have some consciousness about them, and all I'm talking about is self-defense and community protection. All right. There should be the ability for these folks to let folks come back and, you know, let's do some activities where we can teach folks how to protect themselves and their community. And there's nothing wrong with that. Right? So clearly this brother was brilliant, right, in his strategies. Let me continue with this paper. As to Hannibal's lack of reverence for the gods and lack of dependence upon them, the charge fails because the evidence available is of positive and contrary character. A thrill of genuine religious experience is recognizable in the story of his boyhood oath told by Hannibal himself to Antiochus III of Syria. Roman ambassadors had almost succeeded in bringing Hannibal into suspicion with the king. Polybius' account shows that he, Polybius, believed Hannibal spoke and acted with genuine feeling and sincerity, and that Hannibal succeeded in convincing the king that he felt himself still bound by the oath and would never prove false to the gods by whom he had solemnly sworn. Deep religious feeling is evident likewise in the treaty between Hannibal and King Philip V of Macedon, in which the oath is taken in the presence of Greek and corresponding Phoenician divinities, invoked in solemn and impressive language. After crossing the Rhone, Hannibal addressed his men, dismissed the assembly with words of praise to the men, and prayer to the gods in their behalf. Livy tells us that Hannibal went to Gades, fulfilled his vows for the victory of Saguntum, and bound himself by new obligations provided his other undertakings should have successful issue. That he prayed fervently to Jupiter and other gods. What do you guys make of that? That he prayed to Jupiter and other gods. To witness his promise to his soldiers at the River Po. Valerius Maximus quotes Hannibal's words to King Prusius, which are sometimes cited to show his lack of reverence for religion. And the king reported omens unfavorable for a battle, which Hannibal urged. The latter asked again. Like, why would you put that or not? Stupid. Valerius' comments show that these words are mere rhetorical rejoinder, suggesting to the king that God helps those who help themselves. Did y'all pick up on that? right? For you folks who are super religious, and I know you cringe every time I talk about religion and Christianity and all that stuff, but listen to what, you know, an ancient ancestor is saying. God helps those who help themselves, and that's faith. Faith without works is dead, right? If you practice African spirituality, it's the same thing. Gods help those who help themselves. Stop sitting around waiting for folks to come and bail you out. And these folks who you're waiting for are your sworn enemy. Hannibal cannot be convicted of sacrilege in the sense of wanton profanation. Silius Italicus is pure imagination relating what is not elsewhere referred to, that Hannibal burned a temple at Litynum because of his entrance. He saw depicted the story of the First Punic War. The desecration at Saguntum, referred to in rhetorical fashion by Statius, is offset by Pliny. Right? And Livy indeed speaks of the plundering of gold and silver from a temple of Feronia, but this occurred when Hannibal was operating in territory around Rome, when he was in great need. Even so, Livy relates, although perhaps an irony, that the soldiers, from a sense of religious obligation, left in the temple numerous pieces of uncoined bronze. Quotes the annalist Fabius Pictor as saying that Hannibal was about to remove a gold pillar, which may in fact have been a votive offering having no significance as an object of worship, from the celebrated temple of Juno Lacinia, but renounced his intention on being warned in a dream by Juno that such desecration would cost him the loss of his other eye. The point of the story is to be sure that he refrained from sacrilege not because of religious veneration, but from fear of losing another eye. But the point to be noted here is that Hannibal did not pilfer the shrine. It remained inviolate until the time of his departure from Italy, and was profaned neither by Pyrrhus nor Hannibal, although Hannibal for a long time in his headquarters near it. On the other hand, Hannibal held the great temple in such reverence that he set up in it an altar with a bronze tablet, inscription given the record of his achievements. So here's a question too. Hannibal was an educated African, right? Intellectual, educated in Greek and other languages and stuff. Was Hannibal's education, right, also an indoctrination for Hannibal's religion? Because we tend to see that. We tend to see that your education also directs you into your religion, into your relationship with a greater being, a God, right? If you have an African-centered religion, then it would follow that you would look for an African-centered, if you have an African-centered curriculum or education, it would follow that you would look for a African-centered spirituality. If you have a Greek education, chances are you're going to have a Greek spirituality. And with that then comes a lot of problems, right? If you guys understand where I'm coming from, let me know. If you don't, let me know that as well. The Romans talked of Punic faith and perfidy, but with ill grace indeed, coming as it did from a nation guilty of some of the most detestable acts of injustice in history. Rude violation of faith at Messana, treacherous seizure of Sardinia and Corsica, despicable deceit in disarming Carthage prior to the last war, and an infamous record of warfare and diplomacy in Spain. They dwelt in particular on the bad faith of Hannibal until they probably came to believe that mere mention of the term carried its own proof. There's no doubt that the real basis of the charge was Hannibal's inventive craftiness, his mastery of the art of stratagem. Sources reveal no instances showing certainly that Hannibal was guilty of any act of treachery, that he broke a pledged word or violated a sworn promise, or that he voluntarily abandoned a people or town which he promised to support. Many instances of alleged or implied deceit and treachery cannot be taken seriously, such as the concealment of forces, surprise attacks, ruses of various character, operations which often on the basis of Livy's account revealed the rashness and stupidity of the Roman leaders. Stupidity, Roman leaders, rather than the enemy's treachery. Livy does say that after Trezumine, Hannibal violated the promise of release given to a body of cavalry who surrendered to Maharbal. But Hannibal took the position that his officer Maharbal had no authority to make terms without consulting him. The chief in command, a decision that should have seemed sound to the Romans, who more than once refused to ratify terms accepted by their generals on the ground that they exceeded their powers. So basically the Romans aren't sticking to their own word. No surprise. All right, no surprise. The betrayal of Tarantum to Hannibal, Polybius, involves the rules of hunting originated and executed by the Tarentines as a means of developing up the citadel. Hannibal deserves no censure of treachery, unless it be for cooperation in the plan proposed for throwing an important city into his power. The people of Tarentum charged the Romans with various acts of oppression, and of their own volition instigated the conspiracy in retaliation for the severe punishment inflicted upon Tarentine hostages who had attempted to escape from Rome. On the recovery of Tarentum by the Romans, Hannibal is made to say some shit that they don't. It's just dumb. But Hannibal's action was certainly less reprehensible than that of Fabius, who effected a betrayal of the garrison back to the Romans through a young man in his army with whose sister the Carthaginian commander was in love. Hannibal, in attacking Saguntum, is accused of having violated the treaty of alliance which Rome had with that city. As between Carthage and Rome in the Sanctum matter, it was a, quote, a good cat and a good rat, end of quote. The illegal seizure of Sardinia brought Carthage into Spain, where her expansion towards Rome was checked by the Ebro Treaty of the year 226 BC. This done, Rome's subsequent treaty with Saguntum, far south of the Ebro, was certainly a treacherous violation of the spirit of the early treaty. Hannibal, whose mental powers had been feeble indeed had he not clearly recognized this fact, brushed aside prima facie rights on the one hand, invented pretexts on the other, and took Saguntum. His reasons for doing so, advantage and necessity, were just about the same as were Rome's for making an alliance there. But he outwitted the Romans in forcing them to fight in Italy, not in Spain, as they hoped by the Saguntum alliance. Breach of faith is charged against Hannibal in dealing with his southern Italian allies, that realizing he must soon leave them, he loaded them with axes, removed the people from their homes, and confiscated their property. This harsh treatment may have been meted out to some of the wavering or disloyal communities, whose inhabitants he feared would massacre his garrisons. But the general indictment no doubt grew out of the fact that Hannibal could not protect so many widely separated places, and was therefore obliged to abandon some and withdraw his garrisons from others. Such movements, usually accompanied by robberies and violence on the part of the soldiers, may easily bring upon a general unmerited blame and the accusation of bad faith and cruelty. Maybe I'm wrong here. You guys who served in wars before can tell me, but do folks really care about how they look in war? All right? The folks in war, do they care about how they really look? I've seen the chat room. Dorico Cooper is still here and active in the chat room. I appreciate you for that. Dorico Cooper says Neely Fuller areas of activity, right? The 9 areas that white supremacy has cornered, right? War is just one of them. War is just one of the 9 areas. We have to be on point. Right? Religion is another, education another, right? Economics another, right? So Dorico Cooper's listing some of the 9 areas that we are quote unquote being dominated in by the quote unquote white supremacists. The reason why I say quote unquote for some of that stuff, the thing is, like, we allow ourselves to be dominated in some of those areas. There's no reason in 2021, right, you're being dominated in a religious space, right? War, I could see because we're not organized, right? But to say, religion, economics, we haven't figured out that game yet either, which it's just, I've given you my thoughts on economics. It's not Marxism, socialism, all that old shit. I told you all what you got to do. You got to compete. You got to play the game. Dorico Cooper Photography says, we don't care how we look. In war, most people don't care about how it looks. So it's weird that I would be reading something here and people are talking about bad faith and cruelty during wartime, especially in ancient wars. The chief and most venomous accusations against Hannibal is cruelty. We may fairly concede that he was sometimes cruel, for war, even to this day, is inhuman. It's war. What are you doing? Slap fighting? It's war. It was peculiarly so in Hannibal's time. He was less cruel, however, than his times. Was in fact more humane than were Roman generals, with whom cruelty was almost habitual. His knightly conduct and according burial rites were possible to fallen foes. Flataminius, Aemilius, Paulus, Sempronius, Gracchus, and Marcus Marcellus contrast favorably with the brutish barbarity of Claudius Nero towards Hasdrubal. With such savagery did Claudius repay his great antagonist Hannibal, quote, who scorned to war with the dead, end of quote. Hannibal's kindness toward his enemies impressed Plutarch and is noted with emphasis by Polybius, Livy, and other writers, right? So this is where, someone like KW Dawn 7 would say, didn't seal the deal, right? Many of the charges of cruelty against Hannibal are calumnies, pure and simple. For example, that the unransomed captives of Kane were cast into streams and that bridges were thus made of their bodies for the army to pass over. The prisoners were variously tormented and forced to fight friends and their relatives against each other. and his soldiers were taught to eat human flesh. 5,000 prisoners were put to death to escape Fabius at a mountain's pass, that the inhabitants of Nuceria were suffocated after surrender. That senators at Asaray were thrown into wells. That the inhabitants of Casillanum were slain after their ransom was paid. For the remainder of the charges, there is no more ground for the remainder of the charges, there is no more ground than that at a certain crisis he acted in accord with the spirit of ancient warfare. Had he been a monster of cruelty and perfidy, friend and foe alike would have turned away from him in utter abhorrence. Polybius effectively defends Hannibal in general terms by ascribing much to his situation in Italy and to the compulsion of circumstances. He says that the Romans, to maintain their accusation of cruelty against Hannibal, attributed to him the acts of one Hannibal Monomachus, as they did also such of his own acts as were the result of compulsion. All told, Polybius mentions that 2 acts of Hannibal, which he could call cruel, the removal to other cities of civil populations in southern Italy, and the killing of a large number of civilians on a plundering expedition through Umbria and Picenum after the Battle of Trasumene. There is, of course, exaggeration in the tradition of the revelry of Hannibal's troops, the bathing of horses in old wine, etc. But it is entirely possible that after a year's strenuous fighting, his soldiers could not be restrained from retaliating upon innocent citizens the sufferings of their forefathers in the First Punic War. Right? Listen, war is cruel. Right? In fact, I hear some people in the past have talked about fair wars, and I'm like, what's a fair war? This is why you have to constantly be carrying out research and development. That's what the U.S. does. That's one of the things Africa needs to do. Take a page out of China's book and learn to reverse engineer shit. Right? Work on your WMDs, right? Update your strategies, right? This is what strong nations do, right? And to not do it, you know what happens. You know what happens to weak nations. Tariq Cooper says, we care about getting the job done, coming home alive with all your buddies. During the initial invasion in Iraq in 2003, some Marines had to go nearly 60 days without a hot shower. Right? These guys don't give a shit about if they stink, if they smell wretched. They're trying to take out more enemies than enemies can take them out. They're trying to go back home. So this idea that you would paint, Hannibal in this light, right? Try make it, to try make people kind of judge him by how it all looks. But no one cares about that. Let me tell you something. I've never been in a war before. I expect anything to happen. I expect any and everything to happen, literally. I expect folks to be molested. I expect folks to be killed. Right? I expect all of it to happen. Right? No surprise. So we got to get off of that and stop letting folks paint our heroes, right, in a light, right, because, well, in a negative light during a time of war, right? This is the same things they've done to certain African leaders who were warring in the past, right? You got to do what you got to do, man. So I was trying to find something I saw the other day. It looks like I didn't pull it up, so I'm not gonna waste too much time on it now. But there was this article that was talking about how black folks are stealing the image and likeness of Hannibal. And make no mistakes, folks don't want you to be inspired. That's why you have to always think about being the best, you know, being the best African or an African that someone can be proud of. Because they don't like for us to get inspirations. By the way, I'm looking at the thing on, you know, perhaps it's YouTube playing games, but there's 10 viewers right now live with me, only 4 likes. Only 4 likes. You guys make sure, hit the like button. Right? If you haven't subscribed, make sure subscribe. Click the bell to be notified when I'm on, etc. Livy says not a word about this alleged cruelty. Despite Polybius's authority, it is difficult to believe that Hannibal could have deliberately ordered the murder of non-combatants, when imprisonment was the greatest severity shown by him towards prisoners of war. This charge of cruelty is probably pure fiction or a gross exaggeration occasioned by individual acts of barbarity. Such have been known to occur even in the best disciplined armies. See, that last thing right there, that's where I'm coming from. I expect anything to go down. Right? I expect anything. I expect anyone who's fighting to do anything. Right? In the entire 10 books of Livy having to do with Hannibal, there are only 2 indefensible cases of alleged cruelty. We are told that Hannibal burned alive the wife and children of one of Dacius Alteneus of Arpi after seizing his property. The charge of avarice is thus included. Livy says this man, twice a deserter, was a low and despicable enemy and was trying to betray Arpi back to the Romans. The story seems suspicious and like a prideful effort to contrast the Roman commander's moderate treatment of a contemptible deserter with that of Hannibal. Livy's second charge of cruelty is that many natives of Italy who refused to follow Hannibal to Africa and had taken refuge at the shrine of Juno Lacinia were inhumanely massacred in the very temple. According to Appian, Hannibal murdered these men that they might never be of service to the enemy. I mean, hey man, it's war. Whatever this number, this is doubtless the correct explanation and one that removes the reproach of aimless savagery. The same view was held by Mommsen, who apparently passes over the matter as one of absurd exaggeration. Although the right of destroying property and persons from that might harm an army or benefit the enemy was liberally interpreted in ancient warfare. Such gratuitous cruelty is contradicted by practically everything we know of Hannibal's character. Although the right of destroying property and persons that might harm an army or benefit the enemy was liberally interpreted in ancient warfare, such gratuitous cruelty is contradicted by practically everything we know of Hannibal's character. Right? And this could be why he had his downfall. Right? All right, Derica, that's fine. All right. It is also inconsistent with his action in allowing to return to their homes thousands of Spaniards who were unwilling to cross the Pyrenees with him. Tradition is generally discredited as an impossible happening. At least the numbers involved had no basis. Absurd exaggeration is evident. Theodorus says there was a slaughter of 20,000 men. This is a good question. That number in the temple, 20,000 men in the temple, and 3,000 horses. By what means? Appian mentions the killing of 4,000 horses, and a large number of pack animals. Equally senseless is his statement that Hannibal slew with darts in Africa 4,000 horsemen who came to him as deserters. Had Hannibal been guilty of the inhumane savagery which these authors relate, he would certainly have been punished by Carthage, and the Romans would have been able to use against him his own steel-hardened countrymen. These guys have been dealing in propaganda a long time. Right? A long time. You know, that's the paper. All right? Is there anything else you guys want to point out about Hannibal? All right? That's the paper on Hannibal. Let me do a quick station ID. I'll come back and read any messages you might have on the other side.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
This is BAX. You tune into the Harsh Reality Podcast, providing you with social commentary on the news affecting our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the pro-black perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
You are listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Yes, indeed. Also, make sure to check out the Queen's Council. The Queen's Council has dropped a new episode, so check out the Queen's Council as well. But yeah, that's the story of Hannibal. Make sure read up more on his military strategy, particularly in the Second Punic War. You know, things like the Battle of Kane. You know, that's where you get to learn how smart this brother was. You know, keep in mind that when white folks lose, they tend to lie. Tend to lie about how they lose too. You know, black man, some misogynist picks up a white woman, they'll lie and say this black guy must have drugged her and raped her or something like that. Right? You gotta take whatever they say about us as a grain of salt. You know, one thing that paper did not really mention, or it referenced it but didn't talk about it. And KW Don 7, who was in the chat room earlier, said something about it. You know, the Elephant Army. The one thing I tend to associate with Hannibal is the Elephant Army that he had, right? And the paper didn't, you know, do too much talk about his Elephant Army. So let me just say something about that for a second. The story goes that Hannibal had a large number of elephants in his army, most of which were African elephants. The African elephant, if you're not aware, is much smaller in size than the Asian elephants. The Asian elephants are huge, right? The Romans and other enemies of Hannibal tended to use the Asian elephants, right? But I guess the smaller size elephant were more manageable for the Africans. I'm not certain. But he himself, as it goes, they say that he rode on an Asian elephant, right? An Asian elephant with one tusk, which is weird. And the idea is that there was an affinity between Hannibal and that elephant with the one tusk, because Hannibal himself had one eye, which they did mention in the paper. Hannibal wore an eye patch after the Battle of Trebia, right? Apparently there's some statues and stuff that show him with the eye patch. I don't remember seeing that, right? But him and his elephant that he rode on had a disfigurement, and that's the claim that, you know, for their attachment. Let me read this one thing here I came across that says, crossing the Alps to fight the Romans was considered one of the greatest acts in military history. Hannibal knew that victory awaited him as his army was stronger than the Roman army on land. With this in mind, he was able to motivate the entourage over 40,000 men. He was able to encourage over 40,000 men to cross the Alps in order to attain this victory. That's impressive. You know, just to tie a bow on this, in the end, after warring, it is said that Hannibal followed his passion, right, as a writer, where he wrote several military books on military strategy. I don't know if any of them have survived. Do you guys know if any of his military writings have survived? But his death seems to be questionable. Some people think he might have even committed suicide. I'm doubtful of that. You know, I'm doubtful on that. In the chat room, KW Don 7 is still here. He said, had Hannibal been successful back then, we probably would not be dealing with Urugu today. The pro-black perspective is still here. He says, that's the only thing I say. He says, it's on point that I've never heard of Whitey using elephants in war. Rico Cooper Photography says there are many war colleges where people go to study war, history, and knowledge. Yeah, that I know. And a lot of the knowledge in these war colleges actually come from battles with Africans, right? See, they study their losses. They don't, they revel in their victories, but they study their losses, right? Like Derico Cooper probably just said, his tactics, Hannibal's tactics, are integrated into the current Western war doctrine. Same thing with Shaka Zulu, right? I knew a brother who was in West Point, and he was surprised. He told me, and I was surprised at the time, it was back in the 90s, and he was telling me how these guys by name teach Shaka Zulu maneuvers. Right? So, you know, that's our history that we need to connect with. Now, the thing that I say, or the thing that I believe, is that in education, you have to teach war in education. You have to teach self-defense. What I'm trying to get on the Discord, I don't have the Discord open today, or do I? But on the Discord, I'd like to get more folks in there who have military backgrounds, you know, so that we could chop it up about how to defend yourselves. What do you do when you're outnumbered? This is all legal type conversations to have, right? This is what we need. But you don't have to go to a college per se, but those who have studied can come back and become the teachers, can come back and become the instructors, right? The hands-on folks who take us out there, right? Instead of paintballing and just shooting up people with a paintball, let's go out there with some strategy. Let's go out there with the latest, you know, the latest insight. That's what we need, right? It's nice to study what those guys did. It'll be great to know from you guys if you come across one of Hannibal's writings. I don't know if any have lasted the test of time, but I'm sure, like I think Dorico was trying to insinuate, even if the books and the writings themselves haven't lasted, these guys have studied it, copied it, and pasted it into their own works on the subject matter of military science, right? We got to start putting things into practice. You feel me? We have to start putting things into practice, and there's simple ways we can put things into practice. And have our people out here ready, right? Not having to get prepared, but ready, right? So that's what we got to do. That's been the reading of the episode. I won't be on Saturday night. I have a prior engagement. I'll have to deal with that on Saturday. What I might do, and I'm not certain, I usually like to take Sundays as my day of rest. I might do a quick show on Sunday. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, subscribe, click the bell to be notified. So if I do upload content or I jump on live, you guys will be notified, right? And you could hop on with me. As you already know, if you're on the Discord, I always post the episode a few hours before I do it. So you guys will be notified that way as well. Join the Discord. Let's start talking about military science. Let's start breaking it down and putting things into actual practice. All right? The chat room was quiet, but I want to thank everyone who was here. Dorico Cooper Photography, The Pro Black Perspective, KW7, Kevin Care 42. Who else? NYC Sports Archives, NYC Beauties, Black Excellence. You know, I think I got everyone there. I want to thank you all for joining me tonight. And all the other nights that you guys join me, you are much appreciated. Right? Prior engagement means cupcaking. Nah, no cupcaking for me. I got some other stuff to deal with. So, but I appreciate you guys. You guys make sure to go ahead and check out the Pro Black Perspectives recent episodes that dropped. Pretty good stuff. I enjoyed the debate myself personally. It was pretty dope. So you guys go ahead and check that out. Until next time, which could possibly be Sunday. If not, it'll be next week, Tuesday. Until next time, thanks for joining. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Bitter Medicine Podcast with your host, Koku. If you like what you just heard, we hope you pass along our web address, bittermedicineblogs.com, to your friends and colleagues, and share our show to all your social media. Be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous podcasts. This has been a KWAZ radio production. Join us next time for another session of the Bitter Medicine Podcast. Follow us on Facebook at Bitter Medicine Show, Twitter, Bitter Meds, Tumblr, Bitter Meds, Instagram, Bitter Medicine.